Excellent. We're going to get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to AROYA Office Hours Live. This is your chance to learn from the experts, share cultivation tips, and network with other growers in this exciting industry. My name is Keisha. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. A couple of reminders before we get started. While AROYA Office Hours isn't the time to ask things like, will regulations in my state allow me to legally insert activity? Or what does AROYA cost? Although please do feel free to book a demo so we can talk about that. Office hours is the time to ask things like, what are some ways to go from manual growing to crop steering with hardware and software? And this is the data I'm seeing with my grow. Can you help me understand what it means? So for everyone who's joining us today, please do type your questions in the chat at any time. And if your question is selected, we'll have you unmute yourself and ask away. Plus, we have a special treat today. We're sending an AROYA hat to anyone who asks a question during today's live session. So it's pretty cool swag to look forward to. All right. So with that, Scott and Jason, over to you.
Thank you so much, Keisha. And we're excited to be here on AROYA Office Hours today. A little note about the session we had last week, which was a bit different for us, but really interesting. We had Cy Scott on from the CEO of Headset, and talked about a lot of data that growers probably don't have today, but should be aware of as they're looking to understand what cultivars to grow, and interfacing with people from sales and understanding the trends in the industry. A lot of growers have favorite cultivars they really like and stuff they don't like, and but being able to make decisions based on market data is really critical to success. And Seth had some great insights on that. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts before we jump into another topic, Jason, about that? You know, using industry data for strain selection for growers.
It's a great way to benchmark yourself. One of the things that we definitely do see is regional preferences with strain selections. Obviously, California's got a lot of unique stuff that they're pushing from their good database of genetic breeders down there. Up here in Washington, we've got some older strains that have been sticking around for quite a while that retain popularity. Mm-hmm. And so it's a great way to kind of represent, hey, this is how similar we are with what the industry is offering. And it kind of lets people think about where they want to go with the next product they can get to the shelf.
Yep. And it kind of brought up this idea. We don't have this in our analytics page yet, but if you have a strain that is increasing in popularity and the pricing is holding up really well in your state and your yields are going up, like you're figuring out how to grow it better and better, that's kind of that superstar quadrant. Like that's when you're really gonna want to push and make your specialty. Whereas if you're really good at growing something that is declining in popularity, and there's not as much price support there, you might want to think about doing something else or making that switch, because it does cost time and effort to switch for sure. And using market data to help you make some of those decisions, I think would be pretty important.
Yeah, it goes back to something that I talked about a lot during my period as a cultivation operator, and that was, how do we score a strain? Is it based on what parameters? And a lot of times I like to think about how well we can grow it, how fast we can grow it, how much work it takes to manicure and process that product. And Sure. Then also the market demands and what our sales teams really wanted to go in there. So the best way to, from the cultivation side to do that is make sure that you're collaborating with your post-grow operators and managers in that company to say, hey, in 6 months, what type of product do you want to shelf? And then kind of backdate that and start planning ahead for what you need to clone out.
Yeah, really critical, because that process starts with typically mother plants, which is which have a long runway to get to clones, to get to plants in veg, plants in flower. So I think it's critically important. I can see that Michael has asked a question, and I love your question, Michael. We're going to get to it. Before we do, though, we have a special peek into some data from an actual cannabis grower that has plants has had plants in cultivation for a really long time. There is a local company here near us in Eastern Washington State. They are actually a couple of guys have a startup. They were from Washington State, and it's kind of a genetics-based startup. They're doing a lot of breeding, but they also have a commercial cultivation license. And so we collaborate with them a lot. Their name is Dewey Scientific. They do have some brands on the shelf here in Washington. And we really love working with these guys because they're so focused on the science. And they've been great to work with, and happy to test out some of our instrumentation. And while we were there last month, we were like, hey guys, you got a lot of data here, and you're not pushing so hard on the production side. Would it be okay if we showed people in real time what data from a grow looks like and talk about it on office hours? And they told us that we could. So I'm going to have Jason pull up his screen here and show you actually what's going on, a real live AROYA customer. And take it away, Jason. What are you seeing here?
Yeah, so my favorite way to really start looking at new data with when I see a facility, I like to just zoom out into the whole harvest group. And what this does is it gives me perspective on how far we are through this grow cycle. And so right now I can see down at the bottom of the screen, we've got that schedule outline. So that's based on Dewey's preferred crop steering recipe, where they're at right now for this strain. And we can see if we just hover over, we're down here at week 11, just started week 11. We're about day 71 of 88 for this cultivation. So we've just gone into a phase they're calling flush, and that gives me a really good basis to start analyzing what we're seeing in this data. We can also see these annotations down below talking about maybe any of the out of parameter alerts that we're getting, some of the notes and the tasks, or other things that have been attributing this grow cycle. So this is a good way to have a zoomed out perspective. And then we kind of think about, hey, do I want to look at what has been going on right now in the last 3 days? Am I trying to make a decision for tomorrow, or for maybe a phase change that we are doing soon? And then also kind of gives me a perspective on maybe some of the challenges that we've run into over the last 5 weeks running this cycle. And so right now, another thing that I do like to do first is look at the environmental factors, because we do emphasize a lot of energy on crop steering and irrigation insights that the AROYA platform really is an industry leader in providing. But that crop steering is going to be much dependent on what's going on in the environment. So I do like to check off that mark and say, okay, our environment is operating how we want to. It's operating in good parameters to be successful crop steering and driving those transpiration rates, those EC levels that we need for the full potential of this crop. So up here I've got in orange, we've got our air temperature. We've got in purple our relative humidity, and then in green our VPD. So obviously that VPD is kind of one of the numbers I really like to look at first, because we can choose our humidity and our temperatures based on an ideal VPD. Now, that being said, there's usually a preferred range for your temperature that you want to be in for a specific crop, for a specific light supply parameters. And then sometimes there's also restrictions on how well you can control relative humidity. So in this case, these guys are in a greenhouse. It's an airflow, forced airflow, negative pressure greenhouse up here in the Northwest. And so there's a lot of variability in the pushing parameters, what's going on outside in the environment, that makes it a little bit more challenging to have perfect control like we do see available in a lot of dedicated indoor facilities.
Yep.
And so we'll keep that in mind when we're looking at the data, that we do expect to have some influences here that we're probably being controlled as best as possible, maybe not, but they're definitely affected by what can be done with equipment constraints.
Yep. I really like how you said that, because everybody's situation is going to be a little bit different. Indoor grows in particular are typically going to have better control over environmentals than a greenhouse, but the greenhouse spends less on inputs like light, for example. So it's not that we're saying in terms of cultivation that this is exactly what you need to do. All we're saying as a basis is you need to have data as your foundation. and then use that data to understand and improve your methods, and work with the resources that you have, rather than saying it's prescriptive, this is how every single cannabis plant should be grown. So I really like how you said that, that this is Dewey's situation. This is what they're working with. This, they're in a greenhouse, a specific type of greenhouse. And so you can see that in your data. So what are you seeing in their data and their trends?
Yeah, so right off the bat here, I do see a little bit of low humidities during the early stages, which contributed to a higher than preferred VPD. One of the nice things that obviously we do allow in here is showing a target range for those specific ones. So even if I'm looking at somebody that might be growing on purpose quite a bit different than we might suggest from a baseline, they can do these targets, and that is a great representation for the rest of the team, saying, hey, this is what our cultivation director or cultivation manager, the person that is prescribing the schedule for this plant growth, this is where we want to be, right? And so you can see in here that, for the most part, things were running pretty good, and they do end up pushing a little bit higher nighttime, daytime differential here towards the end. And so we can see those nighttime differentials probably to induce a little bit more anthocyanin production. So encourage
get some color.
Yeah, purple coloring in our plants.
Mm-hmm.
And then also a lot of times that is generative cue, where we're planning to tell the plant, hey, assimilants need to be pushed to the buds. So anytime a plant is growing, it has assimilant production where there's a sinking and a sourcing function, or sourcing and sinking, a better way to say it. And what's happening is typically the warmer parts of the plant are where the assimilants are going to sink to.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we develop bud sites, that's a heavier, a denser part of the plant. And when we drop that temperature at night, it's going to retain some of the daytime heat and really encourage that plant to sink assimilant production into those buds.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be kind of a nice side effect of that nighttime day differential that we see here.
Yep. What about the humidity? You mentioned that before.
Yeah, so we're going to turn on humidity. Looks like they only have a target for earlier on here. And obviously, the challenges here is up in the Northwest, it's pretty dry.
Yep.
And so even with
the inland Northwest.
Yeah, the Pac Northwest. We're up here at probably almost getting close to the 49th parallel.
Yeah,
and,
it is.
So it's dry. We're out on the Palouse, and in even these winter months, sometimes it's harder to keep the humidity up, especially because we don't want to turn that pad pump on, because we're going to have evaporative, and we're just going to be fighting ourselves with heaters, especially the gas force heater, where it's burning off humidity anyways. And so even with a humidifier in this greenhouse, they were struggling a little bit during some of these phases to achieve the ideal VPD. And that's why I like to have a couple of these parameters at once. So if we just look at VPD and relative humidity, we already established the temperature was doing pretty good. And so we can see right here, we hit a little above 2.2 kPa for our VPD, which is probably quite a bit higher than would be preferred for this duration. I'd say usually around 1, maybe 1.1 would be a good place to be right here at the beginning of flower.
But this is an improvement, I think. I think they got some heavy duty humidifiers and really worked on this. I mean, I think they had VPDs as high as 3 before. Is that right?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because it's been a huge step for these guys to use a very well-defined monitoring system like AROYA, because a lot of control systems may not provide the feedback that they need to appropriately analyze how their control parameters and how their equipment is working, right? So to some degree, even with the best control parameters, if we're limited by equipment, sometimes equipment improvements need to be made. So add another humidifier, for example. But the first step really there is making sure that your control programming is trying to mitigate any limitations you have to the best ability possible. And that comes down to appropriate set points, appropriate equipment turning on where you need to at different heating or cooling stages throughout that greenhouse. And then also, there's a couple kind of tricks of the trade that you can apply as far as when to open gables, maybe closing and opening your blackout in stages to help burp morning humidity, turning on dehumidifiers maybe a little bit earlier when the lights go off. All that type of stuff comes into play as far as how efficiently you can operate with your equipment limitations.
Yep.
So these guys have dedicated quite a bit of time and energy into reading these graphs very consistently and thinking about ways that they can keep these a little bit tighter into their parameters.
Let's look at the crop steering. Let's look at the rhizosphere. What are you getting from that data set?
Yeah, let's take a look. And actually, let's just jump into light real quick first before we get all the way down.
Because it's a greenhouse.
It is a greenhouse, and these guys are running supplemental lighting, so they should have a little bit more control on trying to achieve a good DLI. And I think we can look at DLI in here as well. So I've got quite a few zones. I'm gonna deselect.
Yeah, these are all. Yeah, these. But you can you can look at the DLI, I think, too.
And I'm also going to say individual sensor readings. What I'm doing right now is I want to highlight the quantum sensor that we have in zone 3 to get a best look at that reading. So with the AROYA system, our climate stations and our substrate stations are using a calibrated solar panel, and it is calibrated for outdoor light. So it does a fairly reasonable job when we're looking at full spectrum sunlight. But as far as specific calibrations for LEDs or HPSs, they don't necessarily have the hardware within that solar panel to be representative of some supplemental HPS or LED that is going on in these rooms.
Yeah, so that is important, and we are working on a feature here that will make it a lot easier just to see the quantum sensor data, because we do consider that to be the highest quality. Right now, it's mixed up with the solar panel data, and the thing solar panel data is super useful for is knowing when the lights are on and off, and getting those alerts. So there is a reason to have that as well, but the quantum sensors are the gold standard. A lot of AROYA customers don't have the quantum sensors, and we weren't selling them until maybe 4 or 5 months ago. So if you were an early purchaser of the system and you want to add that scientific quality PPFD and DLI to your data set, we would absolutely recommend that. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and obviously this does look a little bit busy because it's zoomed out. I've been looking at graphs like this for almost 5 years, specifically in relationship to cannabis cultivation data. And so it might be something that I encourage people to start to absorb and think about zooming a ways out so that your brain can absorb as much information that's going on as possible, and then zoom into the key points that you want to put special attention on.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's something that has happened in the past where you see an anomaly going on, or repeating anomaly are the best ones to try and categorize in your brain, because then you can break it down into something that might be acting weird in the greenhouse on a regular basis. One of the very simple ones that I encountered first was a greenhouse that was operating off of just wall-mounted Honeywell programmable thermostat. And oddly enough, there was a program in there for Monday morning that was different than all the rest of the programs. And so it every week popped up pretty clear that something funny was going on, and it gave a good pointer finger on where our energy should be focused to clean that up.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
So with this light data, I am looking at the top sensor here, and you guys may not be able to see it quite as well just with the clarity on the screen share, but I've got a sensor named Quantum 6701, and it is representing the highest values that are pushing into this graph. And we can see fairly regularly we're hitting up in that, say, 650 to little over 800 micromoles, 850 micromoles. And so in the greenhouse up here in the Northwest, that's great to see.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can push a little bit harder than that, but that's definitely going to provide enough light for very productive growth of those plants.
Yeah. And we actually had a pretty sunny week here last week, and you can see the DLI numbers are higher.
Yeah, and we can just jump in and zoom in on that. Oh, and before I zoom in, we do see some of the root zone data those solar panels on the left side are showing a lot more light coming through. And so as that starts dying off, we can see that the development of the canopy is blocking out some of the light.
Yeah, exactly.
Lower leaves.
Or you can see deleafing activities sometimes. You go through and deleaf, and that, those solar panels, there's more light getting to them now. So you can actually, without even going in the room, you can check and see if your deleafing's been done.
Yeah, one of the first time I ever looked at light data from the substrate sensors, we could see which zones they were deleafing throughout the 2 days.
Right.
And so I was like, hey, they got zones
labor,
1 through
labor
4
tracking.
done.
Yeah. Nice.
Very cool. Yeah, so I did zoom in on this was last week. And what we'll notice is these graphs obviously have some parabolic shape to them, and that's going to be our outdoor sunlight contributing to it. One of the things that we do also see is right here at the photo period on time with these guys, it looks to be about 6 a.m. We can see that our quantum sensor is registering about 500 micromoles. And so right now, these guys are running supplemental lighting throughout the entire day to try and achieve the DLI that they're shooting for. And so in this case, their supplemental lights are contributing about 502 micromoles. And that's why we see the day starting off with 502. Everything on top of that is solar addition from the sunlight here. And we can see this day, this 10th, the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th were absolutely gorgeous. It was, I think, almost 60 degrees up here in Pullman last week. And so coming in here on the 14th, quite a bit less solar contribution into that total amount of micromoles that we're getting. And we'll pop into DLI here, and we'll look at just DLI to see how that affected the plants. So the way that we have our DLI calculator set up is that every day on photo period on, that summation is restarting. So daily lighting integral, DLI, it is an integral just like any other mathematic integral, and it's summating, it's adding up the volume, or the area, I guess would be a better way to say it, the area under the PPDF or PPFD curve. And so in this case, on those days where we had some extra solar contribution, we were able to achieve about almost 32 moles per meter squared on a daily basis. And we see that reset every day. And these less than sunny days, it was closer to about 25 micromoles.
Yep.
And this is where, I think a lot of the crop steering in cannabis, at least, has broken through into the industry from the indoor sector, is because that DLI is going to be very consistent based on the light intensity that you have your lights set at in that room, or how high they are above the crop in that room. And that lets you have a much easier predicted dryback, much easier prediction on what's going to happen for the next day with your irrigation.
Now, I will say though, that even for indoor growers, number one, sometimes what they're actually getting in DLI isn't what they thought they bought when they got their lights. That's one thing. And another, it's going to change every day because your plant height is going to change every day. A lot of growers, I go in and their lights are still on the ceiling. They're not being adjusted to conform with the plant height. So I still think this is a really critical one. And I would go a step further and say one of the analytics that we're working on is to be able to get to grams per mole. Grams per mole is a really awesome productivity metric, especially for greenhouses, because it allows you to account for that seasonality in your productivity. It's like, how many moles of photons did we get, and what do we do with them? And so that's something that we're working on right now. Right now, our best productivity metric is grams per square foot per year, because it accounts for the space that you use. But light is awesome, and these light readings are great because you can then account for seasonality and differences. You might have a different lighting setup in different rooms, and so you might not expect as much productivity out of a room that has less DLI and a different lighting setup. So a really interesting way to look at productivity that we're working on. It's not ready yet, though. So,
and that's exactly right, because in this these greenhouses here in the summertime, we're going to see much closer, upwards of 40 micromoles per meter squared on a daily basis. And so we would expect to have more crop output based on that available energy. So when we look at the photosynthetic equation, light is our catalyst. I mean, it is what is driving the energy in the plant to make those plant foods and produce the largest plant that they can based on all the other variables meeting up with the available light amount.
Yep.
And so when we talk about that seasonality and those metrics that you referred to, obviously we would have a curve that matches our DLI for that grams per square foot. Other variables ignored, it's going to be higher in the summer and lower in the winter.
Yep.
If we equalize that to grams per mole, it's going to be a flat line in reference to how effective you are. So if it's going up, that means regardless of your light amount, you're going to be improving your processes. And so, right now it is pretty easy on a daily basis to try and evaluate that number, simply because grams per square foot, it's a metric of weight per area.
Yep.
And then our moles per meter squared here, it's obviously it's a number of photons per area. So we could easily just times those out and have a moles or grams per mole.
Okay. So what about the root zone?
Yeah, I got us a little carried away outside of that red zone there, but light is probably one of my most favorite things to talk about in reference to cultivation. So yeah, we'll jump in here in the red zone, and we can see very regular irrigations throughout the day. One of the things to note here, some of these ECs are rising a little bit high. These sensors are installed in a round pot, so there's some exposure on those prongs to air.
Yep.
And that's probably why we see a little bit more reactivity on those dry downs than might be usual in something like a cocoa bag, where we're very flush with those sensors, or some rock wool slabs.
Yep. Yeah. And we've talked to Dewey about this, and it's on their to-do list to get those sensors buried more. I mean, anybody who's using a substrate that isn't, pretty homogeneous. I mean, the cocoa bags you can get that you just put water in and they hydrate up, they tend to be pretty consistent. Stonewall is the most consistent one that we've found. But any cocoa that has big old chips in it and stuff, you might get air gaps with your sensor, and that would contribute to inconsistency and high EC readings.
Yep, that's right. And so if we just kind of buffer some of those differences with our head, what we do see is every day getting up to field capacity in this, about 35-38%, very consistently day to day. Obviously here we can see that the irrigation pattern is, at least for the last 3 days, a fairly short irrigation window. So we would characterize that as probably a more generative type of cycling with pretty reasonable drybacks. And these guys are actually irrigating every 2 days, it looks like, to try and achieve a little bit more drastic dryback.
Yeah, and that's, that might be our biggest recommendation to Dewey that we've been talking about, is getting a smaller volume of substrate to work with, and really allowing them to have more control. Substrate is a Goldilocks of, not, you need enough, but not too much in order to crop steer effectively, and to have a healthy root zone. So, that's what I see in these data, is the ability to do more if they had a smaller substrate volume.
That's exactly right. And it's really, really important to take what we say in reference to talking about a plant that's already in the optimal substrate size. Yeah. So much of our crop steering is with the assumption that your substrate is appropriately spec'd out for what you're trying to grow as far as the size of plant. And I think there is some older connotation to thinking about, hey, we need to have a large enough substrate so that there can be available water while this plant is growing throughout the whole day. Well, on the other side of that spectrum is we have aeroponic systems and DWC systems where there's no substrate at all.
Yeah.
And so the plant doesn't necessarily need the substrate if we have the ability to irrigate hydroponically.
Mhm.
And that's where the huge advantages of cocoa comes from, and especially rock wool comes from, is the
Yeah.
fact that really what that substrate is doing is just giving us a physical structure for that root zone to exist.
Yeah, yeah, it's like a canvas to paint on. It's like it can be it provides control. And I do want to say we will dive deeper into Dewey's data in the future. I also want to again thank them for letting us talk through some of their data. I mean, this data is live as of 3 minutes ago. Yeah, what time's on that last reading there, Jason?
We're at about 150.
150, yeah. So
now.
Just a few seconds ago was the last reading, and it's just cool to see what they're doing and also how much they've improved in a really short amount of time through using data to make better decisions. And also, just a shout out again to them, if you are in the state of Washington, they're doing some really interesting stuff on the breeding side. I wanted to share my screen because if anybody, Dewey included, would feel even better about their data to see this kind of test setup that I have, because and I'm calling it I call it Blackfin, and it's a test tent that has some plants in it that we use as a test bed. And as you can see, it is basically all over the place, and it's kind of a sad situation.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry?
Do you want to share that bad
Oh,
boy?
I'm sorry. I didn't hit the right button. Oh, okay, sorry. Thanks. It was a technology moment. Okay, thank you, Jason. So it's there are a couple of things here that are quite sad. The first, although there is one thing that's happy, the first time that I tried to grow plants in this test setup, I didn't hydrate the stone wool properly, and it got channeling, and it was a complete mess. This time, I did get it hydrated properly, and the plants are growing well. A couple of things are really concerning, though. The first is that, especially these last couple of days, I've had the tent has gotten super hot, and I can't figure out why that is. And I've been trying to address it, but you can see the temperature is still 81 in there, too hot. But I do like to think that this is the highest tech growing tent in the world, because I think there's about I think there are 12, 11 or 12 sensors in this tent. I have runoff EC, so when it says EC water here, that's actually the EC that's running off of the plants. There is a quantum sensor in there. There's air temperature. Philip was having me trial a CO2 reading. So actually, if we go back further, let's see if I can do this. So I'm going to go back in time. I'll even have a white line, which is coming. It's not available yet. We're just testing it, but it's actually a CO2 reading to present. That's fine. Okay. Yeah, it's I'll click on CO2. It's beautiful, the white line. So you can actually see that I had some CO2 readings, which I'm not enriching or anything. They're just, whatever CO2 was in my tent at the time. But anyway, super exciting stuff, but a lot of problems here. And I'm struggling, once the temperatures went up, I really started struggling with humidity. I have to go in and refill the humidifier all the time. It's a total pain. The watering system that I have is also substandard because it's just a little pump, and I can only turn it on for X number of minutes per hour, and I can't turn it off at night. It's stupid. Because I'm trying to rig something up to automatically water, and it's just not ready to go yet. So I'm just trying to keep the plants hydrated. The EC is super high. This is a total mess. And then these plants, they're okay. They're surviving, but I can't imagine that they're particularly happy. So anybody who wants to feel better about your grow data, just have a look at mine, and you'll see that I have a lot of areas that I need to improve here. But I'm going to update you guys on how things are going. I think by next week I'll have an automated irrigation system in place. that I can actually be a lot more specific than just water X number of minutes per hour. You can see, actually, Jason has it pulled up on his screen, but if you can see it, you can see that it's just watering every hour. These little spikes here. Okay, it's just watering the plants every hour. Yeah, it's it's really not great. But I mean, the light in there is a pretty good light. The fertigation system is going to work well as soon as I get it going. But I think these ECs are way too high for plants and veg. Is that right, Jason?
I wouldn't say way too high.
Okay.
Well, what are you feeding at for your EC level?
About 3.
Yeah, depending on your nutrient composition and what lights, sometimes it's good by the end of veg to be up there in that feed at 3.0.
Okay. Well, and the stems I do have some purple stems. I've tried to, I don't have a pH meter, so I'm a little bit concerned my pH is too high. So maybe that's going to keep some nutrients from being absorbed by the plant. I'm not sure.
Absolutely. Are you adjusting with a
I do
acid?
put pH down, and this is so typical. But my pH meter ran out of batteries, and I just ordered some on Amazon, and I'm waiting for them. So I'm guessing that the pH is in the right range by adding a little pH down, but it's pretty sad, the entire setup. So look, I'm bringing this up on AROYA Office Hours to say I will do better, and we'll have another look at the data next week and show how I've improved.
It's so good to have this data, right? Like, very cool to look at your data, Scott, and also Dewey, just to kind of really be able to see what the situation is in real time and what kind of considerations come up as a result.
Yep.
And that's what AROYA Office Hours is about. We love hearing from growers what's going on with their situation. We actually have a question from Michael, who's on the call today. Michael, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
I could also read Michael's question.
I'll go ahead and read it. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So Michael writes, as we progress through our later flower cycle, there are strains that consume a heavier water content. These strains tend to have a higher rise in EC overnight. What would you recommend to limit that EC rise for these plants?
I mean, the best approach would be start documenting how much different those strains are. Run them in different rooms if you can. If you can't run them in different rooms, then maybe possibly do a different feed EC on each of those zones. And I mean, obviously, to limit that rise, you could open up the irrigation window, but that's going to distract you from the crop steering parameters that you're shooting for those plants. That being said, sometimes those differences you're seeing also means that you might be wanting to tailor those strains with a little bit different crop steering windows. Maybe if one plant is a little stretchier than the other ones, go for a longer generative cycle.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that Michael's question here is about is not wanting to have the EC rise as high at the end of flower. Although, can it? I think some people are still trying to get those ECs up to tell the plant that it's kind of done, but it should not, to limit foxtailing kind of in the ripening phase. Is that right, Jason?
That's absolutely right. And so, historically people call it flush, and ironically, it looks like Dewey was calling it flush as well. I really tried to avoid the term flush because it has some implications of straight RO, meaning no nutrients included, which really scientifically at this point is not a suggested parameter for any type of low cation exchange capacity hydromedia. So when I talk about that, rock wool cation exchange capacity CEC is very, very low. And so if we go in with an RO water, that substrate EC is going to drop drastically fast because it's not hanging on to any of the nutrients in it. It's getting flushed out. And that can cause your plant cells to rupture. That big of osmotic potential that gets applied immediately can be detrimental. And also in that fact is even if the plant cells don't rupture, which is bad because it's going to give a site for botrytis to set in very quickly, which is the worst time pretty much absolutely possible for something like that in a harvest cycle, because you do have all that bud mass, but you can also just starve out the buds, so it's going to limit the amount of growth that is happening, and that's a critical time. We want that that photosynthesis to still be very active for those last weeks, so we can get a nice terpene profile, a nice finish on this plant.
Is there anything that the myco could do to reduce how open the stomates are at night? Because cannabis plant is unique in the plant world because its stomates are open at night. Is there anything like with agitation of the air or BPDs that could help? Because I mean, you will get plants consuming water at night at a much lower rate than during the day, but it sounds like he still sees a concentration. You know, the plant's taking up water, the salts are getting concentrated in the substrate. He wants to keep that EC down. Is there anything else that he could do to reduce kind of that water use rate?
Sure. I mean, like we showed earlier a little bit, nighttime differential, dropping those temperatures at night is going to decrease some of that stuff. But I would kind of just more focus on what the goal is. And, Mike, I'm happy to talk to you a little bit about some of the specific numbers that you're referring to. So things that I'm thinking about is exactly what is late flower? Are we talking about the last 2 weeks? Are we talking about the last 3 days? What is a high EC? Are we talking about 15?
He just put that in, actually. The ones he's typically they get to 8 or 9, but these ones he's talking about, they get to 11 or 12. Is that any concern for you?
No, absolutely not.
Okay. Yeah, that's super helpful.
And with the consideration that, you still are doing daily irrigations, and that those daily irrigations are bringing your substrate EC back down, right? So when we think about how close we are getting to our feed EC with that daily EC, we definitely don't want it to see a daily average at maybe 11 or 12 during that time. But if we're getting back down to, say, 4, 5, somewhere in those ranges, plus or minus some, depending on other parameters in the facility. But if it is getting back down to half those numbers, then I would have no concern at all. I would actually suggest that that's a very productive ripening tactic.
Yeah, it actually looks really good. Okay, Chaotic Kirk.
Chaotic Kirk, please unmute yourself and ask your question. And if you're having trouble unmuting, if you can type your question in the chat, I can go ahead and, oh, there he is.
I think I figured it out. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So I just had a basic question as to how many, what's the sample size for a room that might have maybe 1,500 to 1,400 plants in it? How many plants should be sampled to actually collect this data that you guys are doing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kirk. And we actually Jason did a video on this, so we'll provide a link in the chat, Keisha, maybe. Would that be all right? But happy to talk about this because it is a question that we talk about all the time. What is a representative sample? And there's two things that are critical here. One is just not spending more money than you need to. We know we are a maker of the wireless sensors that are used in the substrates, and the more of them you put in, the more money it costs, and people are trying to keep costs down. So that's the upper limit of sensors. I mean, if you could put a sensor in every single plant, great, but that would cost millions of dollars, and we know people don't have that type of money to spend just on gathering data on the rhizosphere. On the other hand, though, you don't want to sample too few plants, or you're not getting a representative sample. Think about just sampling one plant in a room of 1,500 plants. and then making all your steering decisions based off that, and finding out that, the emitter was, one of the emitters was in a little bit crooked and that plant wasn't getting watered very much, and it was an anomaly. So Jason, what's your recommendation there on finding that balance between sensors and representative data?
We like to go for about one sensor per every 100 square foot of canopy. And the reason that we use square footage is just because of, thinking about people running different planting densities. You could say per plant. Square footage is just a little bit easier number, because if people are adjusting their per plant quantity by strain or by room or any other types of stuff, maybe they're just trying some different planting densities, it just gives us a really stable number to work with when we are talking about these places and quoting it out. And really what it comes down to is using those sensors to evaluate crop uniformity. And I talk about this in the video, where uniformity is an instantaneous picture of how close these plants are behaving to the plants next to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we have really good crop uniformity, then we may or may not need quite as many sensors. If crop uniformity is struggling, then absolutely you need a lot more sensors. Well, how do we evaluate crop uniformity? With the sensor data. So that's why we like to start with that 1 per 100 square foot, is so that it gives you a reasonable suggestion of how uniform those crops are grown.
Yeah, and we always recommend that people do things like go in and randomly sample from your drippers in the rooms to look at, am I getting the same or similar amount of fertigation water each time I'm watering? What's the differential there? Another good practice is to go around with a Solus, with a handheld device and the alignment tool. Poke it into the bag and kind of take some random readings around the room. How well do those readings agree with what your room readings are at the time? And the other thing that people, a lot of people have asked, not a ton, but some, when we quote out the system too, is they say, well, I'm already getting environmental data, so I don't really need your climate stations, which is fine with us. But there's a couple issues with that. The first is just that it's so much easier for us to pull the data into our platform with our sensors, because they're already interfaced, and you just push a button and it starts. Another thing is that, those climate stations don't really add much to the cost of the system. The substrate sensors are what's unique about what we do, and we spend a lot of time on them. But the climate sensors, you only need 1 or 2 per room anyway, so they don't add that much to the cost. And the third thing is, Jason already mentioned this before, it's really nice to have another source of data to triangulate what's actually going on in your environment and just compare to the sensors that you might already have. Because sometimes sensors are wrong, and it's good to be able to for something that's as important as the climate is to your ability to grow plants. It's good to have more than one source of data.
That's great information. I do really want to reiterate what you were talking about with some of those manual readings, going in, doing crop registration throughout the grow cycle, especially critical points, saying this is the growth that we're seeing day to day. So taking plant heights. It's great to take the plant height of the plant that you have sensors in, so that your growth data represents also the data on here. Absolutely put that information into your harvest group so that it's documented for later, so that you can graph it right next to your continuous data readings from the system. And AROYA supports a pretty wide range of manual readings that you can graph right into your interface. So that's a very valuable practice, and we do absolutely encourage that you use the AROYA system not only for capturing and interpreting data, but just using it as a grow journal, a digital grow journal for everyone at your facility that's involved in cultivation to be participating, contributing in, and utilizing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. And Mike also mentioned they run 1 sensor every 50 plants and having good results. That's at a planting density of roughly 0.5 or 0.45 plants per square foot, then that works out to roughly your 100 square feet there, Jason. So So thank you, Michael, for contributing that. I think that might be all the time that we have. Keisha, is it right?
Yeah, we have a few more minutes. You want to answer a couple questions from Instagram?
Let's do it. Let's do a speed round.
We'll do a speed round. Excellent. Okay, so this one comes from Terp City. They write, just ordered my sensors, had 2 quick questions. I am feeding in 2-gallon cocoa bags. It takes me 35 minutes to get runoff with 2.27 GPH drippers in each pot, gallons per hour drippers in each pot. Number 1, what is the target moisture I am aiming for during a feed to make sure it's wet enough to get the proper runoff? And the second question is, what is the optimal moisture level I should be at before feeding again to make sure I'm getting proper dry back?
Yeah, that's a hard one for the speed round. I will say that it depends, and 2 gallons is a lot of substrate, and it's not surprising it's taking that long to get runoff. I think the strategy is not typically a feeding that much water in one time. It's this P1, P2, P3. Where you're doing a sequence of say, let me take a step back. The first thing you have to do is to understand the volume of your substrate. So it's 2 gallons, and then understand what your feed rate is, like he was saying, and then calculate your shot size. And typically, shot size for generative steering is going to be a little bit higher. Roughly what percent?
Yeah, I think our standard suggestions for generative would be like a 5% irrigation shot.
Yeah.
And obviously, I mean, in generative, you're not going to be doing P2 irrigations in general. You're just going to be running P1 irrigations over a 1 or 2 hour irrigation window. So that shot size might be larger, just depending on what types of equipment you have, how many times you can irrigate in that 2 hours. So it's definitely not a hard line saying you should use 5% every time you're running generative. It's just a rough statement of saying this is 5%, whereas vegetative would be more like 2 or 3%.
2 or 3, yeah. But with that 5% shot size, you're not going to reach saturation in the first shot, during that P1 of generative. So, you're going to be running maybe 6 or 7 to get up to having runoff?
Sure. So if we had a 25% dry back, in a 2 gallon, probably more realistic to have maybe a 20% dry back. So if we're 5% shots, if all of the theoretical numbers are working out, then in 4 shots, we would be at exact field capacity, and that 5th shot would be going to runoff.
Yeah. And so then then the question is, do you want runoff or do you not want runoff based on where your EC is? And if you're wanting that EC lower, then yeah, you want runoff. So, but then once you've hit that saturation point, and I think in cocoa that's less than 50%, right?
It's really going to depend on the pith chip ratio, the size of that cocoa. So depending on the supplier, if it's mixed, which line you've used. And actually, Ramsey Nubani did a great video on how to establish your field capacity for any specific media. So check that out on our Instagram. He does give a really easy step-by-step process on how to calculate it using a simple kitchen scale.
Yep. And then once you have that, then but that moisture number is going to be lower than Rockwell, for example.
Usually.
So once you get up to that field capacity, the goal is in generative to be getting up there within that 2 hour window, and then drying back for the next 22 hours, essentially. So drying back for the rest of the time the lights are on, the night, and then the time when the lights come on and are waking up. And then you go back to hitting it with 5% shots up to field capacity again. So it will depend a lot on what your substrate is and what its capacity is. But in a 2 gallon cocoa, a typical 2 gallon cocoa bag, you should expect to have a little bit smaller dry backs than you would in, say, Rockwell, or in a 1 gallon cocoa bag, for example.
Great. And believe it or not, you did answer like 3 questions. with that discussion. Thank you for that. This is a good one. Think we could do lightning on this. This is from at D1 Gawan from Instagram. For rooting into slabs, should I be generative, vegetative, or keep full saturation at all times?
I'm just going to ignore the second part of that. As far as which crop steering techniques, I like to have rooting in kind of as its own separate type of activities, simply because what we're trying to do is encourage that root zone to seek out the water in the slab. So if we're doing a 4x4 onto a slab, obviously when we set that 4x4 on it, those roots have pretty much absolutely no grab of pulling water from the lower slab. Obviously those drippers should still be up in the 4x4. So we do want to at least irrigate 1, maybe 3 times a day during root in to try and encourage that plant to stay alive. Anytime we irrigate, there's a response, a plant response that encourages some amount of root growth. But we do want to make sure that we're not over irrigating, we're not staying at saturation point, because we want those roots to look for the water in that slab. So when we put them onto that slab's usually going to be up towards field capacity for that media. And, by day 3 or 4, hopefully that irrigation process has encouraged those roots to seek out as much of that slab volume as possible.
And I think, doesn't pH play a role as well?
Specify more, please.
When you saturate the slab, because I can't remember what it was.
Sure. I think what you're talking to is...
Isn't there a differential between, like, let's say you put a 4x4x4 block on a slab, and if there's a differential in pH, what is the differential that would make the roots want to go down in the slab, or is there one?
I'm personally not aware. I haven't necessarily looked into that before. The one thing that is going on down there is in most slabs, most of the manufacturers that I'm familiar with of any type of rock wool from the factory, they do impregnate the rock wool with wetting agents.
Oh, right,
and
right.
So
surfactants.
when we do try and wet out, when we try and soak up those slabs for the first time, it is good to go at a little bit lower pH, right? So if our ideal pH for rock wool is during irrigations at 5-6, some of these companies recommend that you first saturate the slab with 5.3, 5.4, try and help dissolve some of the chalk,
some of the surfactant.
Also, and break that stuff down. And so,
what about the EC or the ppm or whatever? Will roots go in from areas of high concentration? Will they be attracted to areas if there's not as much there's not as high a concentration of salts in that slab?
Yes. So we are looking at osmotic potential, and it's going to depend a little bit on what those exact values are in the plant, in the 4x4, and in the substrate. We could play with that a little bit more. I definitely feel like
I'm just about to do it. That's why I'm so interested. I don't care at all about AROYA office hours. I'm just trying to figure out my grow here, Jason. So, and I think maybe like within a week or 10 days, I'm going to have to put the plants onto a slab. So, just out of curiosity. Okay, Keisha, is that it?
That's it. Scott and Jason, thank you so much for this conversation. I want to make sure to ask Chaotic Kirk and Michael to stick around for just one more minute so we can get their contact info and send them an AROYA hat. Thank you for asking your questions. Thank you to our Instagram community for submitting questions as well. And thanks to all of you for joining Office Hours Live this week. If you have any questions about AROYA, how it can be used to improve your cultivation production process, or any other topic you want to cover in a future edition of Office Hours, please post it in the chat. Shoot us an email at support.aroya@metergroup.com, or send us an Instagram DM. We definitely want to hear from you. We record each session. We're going to email everyone in attendance a link to the video from today's discussion. It will also live on our AROYA YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, and please follow and spread the word. And we'll look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.